Welcome everyone to the November Discovering History Seminar. I'm Dr. Jennifer Jones in the History program at Trobe University. I'm situated at the Wodonga campus, but I used to be at Bendigo, so I can see a few familiar faces. Welcome. These seminars are a collaboration between the Trobe University, Bendigo Regional Archive Centre, Goldfields Library and the Golden Dragon Museum. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the Dja Dja Wurrung as the traditional custodians of the land here at Bendigo, and also the traditional owners of the land where people are zooming in from. Their sovereignty was never ceded. La Trobe University recognises Dja Dja Wurrung's ongoing connection to the land and acknowledges elders past and present, and welcomes any Indigenous participant and recognises them if they're here tonight. The format tonight is that the speaker will speak for 40 minutes and we have 20 minutes of questions and discussion. We'll take face-to-face questions first and then we'll move to the Zoom participants. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ruth Ford, who is convener of the Discovering History monthly engagement seminars at Bendigo since 2017, has connected wide local audiences, including yourselves, to stories of the past and to the scholarly community. Ruth joined La Trobe's history program as a teaching and research scholar in 2001. With a prior degree in photography from RMIT, Ruth's approach to history has been shaped by serious engagement with the visual as well as textual and human sources. Her groundbreaking PhD, titled Contesting Desires, Narratives of Passionate Friends, Married Masqueraders, and Lesbian Love in Australia, 1918 to 1945, from La Trobe University in 2000, was supervised by Katie Holmes and Marilyn Lake. Ruth's research has focused upon gender, identity and agency, women's rural labour, landscape and place, whiteness and settler colonial identities, as well as urban and rural modernity and lesbian and queer sexual identities in the 20th century Australia. Now, this is broad expertise and it reflects Ruth's inquisitive mind and her ethical drivers, which include finding ways to recognise and honour voices that have been marginalised or hitherto considered unworthy of historical attention. Today, Ruth is presenting a paper entitled Testaments of Mothering, Letter Writing, Support and Community in 1930s Rural Australia. And this is from her forthcoming book, provisionally titled Dear Miranda, Letter Writing, Isolation and Community in 1930s Rural Australia. The book focuses on women's letter pages in the Weekly Times Indian War period. It examines the emotional communities formed between letter writers through the conduit of a popular rural newspaper column. Regular correspondents chose pen names to support their real and imagined identities and to highlight favoured characteristics, choosing pen names like Still Smiling Cockie's Wife and Tulip Time or Endeavour. The letter writers gained support by sharing their aspirations and their lived experience on the land. In this forum, they could talk frankly about their relationships with husbands and children and their on-farm and domestic work, as well as pressing political issues of the day. Today, Ruth's focus is upon health-related women's issues, including infertility, birth experiences, and child illness. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd also like to acknowledge the Dja Dja Wurrung as the traditional custodians of the land we're on, and that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past and present and to any Indigenous participants. Using the pen name Heather, wrote her first letter to the Weekly Times women's pages in October 1931. I read with interest and sympathy Lois's letter about her troublesome children. I live 28 miles from any township, have 9 children and have to do all my own work, partly on account of hard times and partly because it's difficult to keep health, so far from amusements. I have no domestic conveniences in the labour-saving way, And seeing I was born and educated in London, it's certainly been tough work. Still, my children all keep well and all have hearty appetites, even my tiny son of 18 months. Heather began to write regularly to the Weekly Times, with over 50 of her letters being published during the following decade. Many of Heather's letters mentioned her children or responded to other readers' letters about children. Mothering was central to her identity in her letters. In 1931, her 9 children were aged from 18 months to 16 years old. Having 9 children and no domestic help attributed to geographical isolation as much as their economic situation, and no modern labour-saving devices was compensated for by having healthy, vigorous children. Her description of their property being situated on the open plains grazing country in the Riverina, and her account of employing a school teacher, as well as her depiction of being born and educated in London, constructed an image of Heather as a relatively affluent grazier's wife, having fallen on hard times during the Depression or drought. This constructed identity will become important later as I discuss Heather's actual circumstances, which I was able to piece together from fragments in her letters. So in September 1931, in the midst of the Depression, Australia's largest rural newspaper, the Weekly Times, launched a section dedicated to women's issues, the Women's Bureau, as it was called. It was a huge success, and women from all over regional Victoria and southern New South Wales responded to a call for contributions and letters. The pages were edited by an editor, and the first one was Sonia Hardy, with the simple pseudonym Miranda. The lack of a surname implied she was an intimate friend rather than an editor of high standing in the newspaper fraternity. And the pages included the women's point of view, letters from Weekly Times readers, a readers' exchange column, recipes, hints, and requests. Letters to Miranda poured in from readers, embracing an opportunity to express their feelings and views, share their lives, gain support from others, and find pen friends. Readers wrote in with news of their babies and children and asked fellow readers for material for baby clothes and shoes, plant cuttings and seeds, parenting and domestic advice or employment, as well as offering support and sympathy to other readers. The thousands of letters and messages each year gave an extent of the active readership. At a time when many experienced economic hardship stemming from the Great Depression and drought, the letters served an important function in the lives of white rural women. These women were living in isolation and seeking connection and support from others experiencing similar troubles. Although the letters explore many themes of motherhood and fertility, in this talk, I will explore just a few of these, particularly through the letters of 2 contributors, Heather, who I've already mentioned, and Mally Dust. And these 2 contributors raise issues of grief from child mortality and women struggling to raise children as sole breadwinners. Heather offered parenting advice, but also sympathy. And in 1932, she wrote, "Today I received a letter from Carnation. I regret to say her wee daughter was born on the 27th of April and died on the 11th of May. Carnation asked me to let the other readers know, as she is far from strong and feeling quite unequal to writing many letters. For one brief fortnight, Carnation experienced the joy of motherhood, and then it was taken away. These things are hard to bear alone. Perhaps our kind readers will spare a few minutes to write her a brief note of love and sympathy." And a number of women wrote offering their condolences and support to Carnation, and many shared their own experiences of their babies dying. In 1934, Heather's second youngest son, Freddie, became ill. She wrote offering her sincere thanks for all the kind wishes about my little son, who I'm glad to say continues steadily along the road to recovery. She noted that he was an occupant of Auntie Connie's Cut, an expression for children in hospital with infantile paralysis, which reached epidemic proportions in the 1930s. Heather hoped she will be able to fetch her little boy soon and empathised with other mothers with ill children. "I do hope Spiderweb's boy is going on well. Nobody but a parent can realise what an awful heartache a delicate child can be. Others wrote optimistic letters of hope, rejoicing at Freddie's progress, causing Miranda to comment, owing to hundreds of letters received and great pressure on space, my blue pencil has been busy. Nearly every message received contained a message for Heather, rejoicing at the progress of her little son. Heather's letters continued in a light, chatty vein until winter 1935, when she described her son Fred as being very sick, with doctors thinking he would not survive. And the response that Heather received was overwhelming. And she says, some of the letters have given me fresh hope, for they are very beautiful, full of kindly thought and womanly feeling. Some people have offered to send picture books and others have sent other gifts. Country cousin sent Fred a pocket knife, which he was much pleased with. But after this letter, Heather's letters seemed to avoid the topic of Fred's health, writing of other things, including the Jubilee, what she was reading, an account of taking a sick friend to a hospital in Swan Hill and Bendigo. And while in Bendigo, she attended the opening of the Australian Women's National Convention League, went to the footy grand final, I think Sandhurst and Eagle Hawk were playing, visited the art gallery, and wrote accounts of what Bendigo was like. In February, Fred was at home, but another letter referred to Fred's poor health within a very long letter. And she said, Kildana, I'm sorry you've had so much trouble with little Kevin and do hope he will go strong. I'm sorry to say Fred is not doing so well just now. Of course, this is a bad time of year for him, but from now onwards, I had to take him to the doctor last week and there'd been several bad nights. And by June, Fred's condition had deteriorated and Heather wrote, I shall be unable to write to my Women's Bureau friends for an indefinite time as I have Fred very ill at home. And he says, the doctor said he has to be kept in bed or go to hospital. The doctor thinks Fred has developed an abscess on the lung and is afraid there may be a cardiac collapse at any time. So he needs much care, practically day and night. I have very little leisure as household routine has to be got through somehow. And I find myself doing household tasks at all sorts of queer hours in the effort to catch up with time lost in the sick room. Fred is beginning to look very frail and has very restless nights. It's hard to approach him with a smile when one's heart is so sad, but of course he thinks he will get all right. And only yesterday said, I wonder what job I will get when I grow up. So please tell readers, I have not forgotten them, but just cannot write. And this tragic letter describing Fred as beginning to look frail and her struggle to hide her sadness from her 8-year-old appears to be a way of acknowledging that he was unlikely to survive. The letter also documented her physical exhaustion and the juggling of the long hours required to care for a very sick child amidst the usual very demanding domestic work. And her desire to care for Fred at home rather than leaving him in a hospital a long distance away from her home reflects her desire to be with him until the end, as well as perhaps the difficulties of leaving her domestic work and her other 8 children for long periods, not to mention the expenses of hospital care. In the months following, there weren't any further letters from Heather about Fred's condition. He died in November 1936 at Denilquin, 80 miles from their home. Hundreds of readers wrote letters of sympathy. Isn't Heather having a sorrowful time, wrote Nanny. So many belonging to the Women's Bureau have lost loved ones through the year, and to these and Heather I send my sympathy. Jacqueline wrote, let me extend Heather my sincere sympathy in her loss of her Freddie. She will miss him, I know, but is comforted by the thought that his little body is free from pain, so she would not wish him back. I too have lost Heather, but it was all for their best, and it is cruel to wish a sufferer back on earth. Time heals all wounds, Heather. Some 9 months after the most intense stage of Freddie's chronic illness and 3 months after his death, Heather writes her next letter. I will try and renew some of my friendships in the Women's Bureau and shall be happy to receive letters from those who care to write again. I will say once more how grateful I have been for all the loving messages, gifts and thoughts. First, on behalf of my little son who passed on, and secondly to myself during the time of my anxiety and the many expressions of sympathy I have received since my loss. Heather returns to writing long descriptive letters, including recounting the coronation and her move off the station to live in a border town, Swan Hill. However, her grief about Fred is ever present. She notes Fred's little garden is flourishing and she has brought all his treasures with her, and describes the lovely painting of her beloved son. As I write, he is looking down at me with a sweet, shy smile. She recounts being lucky to get such a happy snap of him during one of his well times, which were so few, never dreaming that so soon it would be all I should have of him. She had the photograph made into a beautiful painting, which gave her much pleasure. For Heather, the material traces of her young son, his garden, his treasures, and his painting evoked rich memories and brought Fred closer, providing some solace. Amidst her intense grief, Heather writes, conveying her appreciation of the support from Weekly Times readers, and she recalled his last day. Books, toys, flowers, everything that might have given a little sick boy pleasure. And these gifts from unknown readers and writers did give him much happiness, right up to the day when his sleep was too deep to waken him. That morning he had flowers on his table, planted by himself and grown from bulbs sent to him by a Women's Bureau reader. And they gave him his last little pleasure, for he always loved flowers. So in this writing, Heather's reliving Fred's last months, weeks and day, providing a way of keeping her precious memories strong and close. And just before Christmas, Heather writes a long letter urging a little personal gift to poor mothers, passing on a little joy in the joyous season. And she addresses her words to the sad from one who has had much sadness. Take heart and realise all is for the best, even though it's desperately hard to do so at the time. Just as Christmas means the birth of a saviour, so New Year means the birth of a new span of life. We all start a fresh page on the 1st of January. Last year's lessons are finished and we must take up our life's work with renewed hope and ambition, always striving to make ourselves worthy of the dear ones who have left us. And her words seem like an attempt to leave behind her intense grief and move beyond her heartbreaking loss of her child and begin a new life. She writes in the bracing moral expectations to be stoical, yet at the same time, she insists on the value of memorialising lost loved ones, saying, I save all Freddie's plants, which were planted by his own dear hands, and I tend them for him, as the cemetery is 74 miles away. Heather's multiple letters over years means she had become well known to readers of the Weekly Times women's pages. There were constant messages inquiring about her, sending messages of support and sympathy, or comments about how much they enjoy her letters. And in 1939, photographs of some contributors and their children were published on the pages, and a portrait of Heather is featured. My slides have been out of sync, no one's told me, sorry. And as well as the photograph of her youngest son. Heather's frequent letters with specific descriptions of her location, 28 miles from Moolameen, 50 miles from Hay and 76 miles from Deniliquin, and the ages and number of children enabled her to be identified by locals some 70 years later. Thanks, Jennifer. Her letters emphasise the silences created by women themselves and what they chose not to reveal about their lives as women and as mothers within the women's pages. The woman who used the pen name Heather was in fact Violet Nisbet, who lived at Dry Lake Station, Booraban, on a 6,000-acre property with her husband Bill Nisbet. Surrounded by large pastoral stations of 40,000 acres, 6,000 acres in dry country was a small property which would have struggled to support a family of 11 people in poor years. While Violet wrote repeatedly of having 9 children, she doesn't mention the blended nature of her family. 6 of her children were from her husband's first marriage, 2 children were from her current marriage, and 1 was from an earlier relationship. Violet had married widower Bill Nisbet in 1927, when his children were aged from 5 to 12 years old. And after the marriage, she gave birth to 2 children, Fred in 1928 and Douglas in 1930. I wondered if Violet did not mention the family makeup because she absolutely regarded her husband's children as her own after caring for them for years, or whether she wanted to avoid judgment. I then discovered that the marriage was Violet's second one, following a divorce in 1926. And the extreme stigma surrounding divorce in the 1930s may have contributed to her decision. So Violet had married Herbert Mitchell, aged 41, in 1920 in Melbourne. She'd arrived from London 2 days earlier, having emigrated to marry Herbert. Travelling with her was her 3-year-old daughter, Frances Muriel, and it appears that Muriel was conceived in an earlier relationship. Violet gave her conjugal status as spinster and her occupation as home duties. But within less than 3 months of the marriage, Violet had been deserted and had to find work as a housekeeper to support herself and her young daughter. In 1926, Violet petitioned for divorce for Herbert on the grounds of desertion. In her affidavit, she detailed her marriage breakdown, which had occurred shortly after her arrival in Australia. After their marriage, they'd moved to the Reservoir near Albury, where Herbert worked as a labourer. They lived in a tent in a work camp, which was predominantly men. And in November, Violet became seriously ill, and after losing an alarming quantity of blood, Herbert drove her to the Albury Hospital. Violet makes no mention of miscarriage in her divorce affidavit, but her description and timing suggests that a miscarriage was likely. When she was partly recovered several days later, the hospital matron told her that her husband had disappeared 3 days earlier. After being discharged from hospital, she returned to the camp, finding a note from her husband in their tent. My dearest and only love, may you and everybody forgive me. Your love has been the only happiness in my life. I am on the verge of lunacy and am not responsible. My memory fails me every minute, and I am afraid of everything. What a coward I am. I am and feel so heartbroken. Frank. So Violet was then served a 24-hour notice to quit the Reservoir work camp. Not only was her husband no longer employed, but before leaving, Herbert had let it be known that he'd given his wife syphilis. Violet made inquiries with her husband's fellow workmen and the police as to her husband's whereabouts, and police investigations didn't locate him. Her husband's fellow workmen contributed money so she could get to Melbourne. Homeless and destitute with no family or friend support, she had to find work. She obtained a position as a housekeeper at Yarram in Gippsland. And after arriving, Violet received a batch of letters from her husband, which had been forwarded on from Hume. And her husband expressed remorse that he'd infected her with the said disease, but also complained bitterly that she'd turned the police on his tracks. We don't know if Violet had contracted syphilis from her husband and if it was the cause of her ongoing ill health, or if her son's respiratory illness was in any way related to congenital syphilis. It's possible that Fred's respiratory disease and growth on his lung was the result of congenital syphilis, which he could have contracted in utero, rather than the implied infantile paralysis. Campaigns against syphilis emphasised transmission to wives and children and the threat to the white race. However, just as the women's pages made no mention of wife battery, there was no discussion of women or children being infected by syphilis by their husbands, including servicemen who returned home with the disease. On the 10th of March, in March 1924, Violet began working at Dry Lake, Booraban, as a housekeeper and for recent widower William Nisbet, whose 6 children were aged from 1 to 8 years. It appears that her daughter Muriel, now aged 7, came with her. Violet got her divorce in 1926, and 4 months later, she married her employer, Bill Nisbet. Her affidavit stated that she'd saved out of the amount of her earnings as a housekeeper in order to bring about the proceedings. But given the prohibitive cost of divorce in the 1920s and housekeepers' low wages, 20 to 30 shillings a week, It's likely that Bill desiring to marry her contributed to her legal cost. The close-knit rural community of Bourbon and Moolameen would surely have known that Violet, the news station owner's wife, had been his housekeeper for the previous 2 years in areas of large 40,000 acre stations. The wife of a small station on only 6,000 acres would have been marginalised. But as the ex-housekeeper, she was likely to have been socially shunned by neighbouring pastoral families, and that she applied for divorce in Victoria instead of New South Wales, where she was living and working, may have been an attempt to keep the divorce secret and out of the press and gossip networks within her region. It's likely, though, given the closeness to the Victorian border, that individuals in Moolameen may have seen the detailed divorce story in The Age or the brief divorce notice in the Argus. And no doubt the news scandal travelled fast within the rural community. So the Women's Bureau letters column enabled Violet to reinvent herself as a station owner's wife who was London born and educated and the exemplary mother of 9 children. The Women's Pages provided her with a community in which she was highly valued and esteemed for her contribution, and which provided close friendship and emotional support. Violet's pleasure in extensive letter writing, both to the Women's Bureau and to the pen friends she found through the Weekly Times, was in part no doubt due to her geographical isolation, but it may have also been related to her being socially ostracised as a divorcee. Her pen name enabled her to escape local moral judgments. Instead of seeing Heather's efforts to assist poor mothers in need by sending clothing as the work of an affluent do-gooder, Violet emerges as a woman who had first-hand experience of poverty as a deserted wife and mother. And as a deserted wife and mother, generously giving as much as she could while her own family struggled to make ends meet. However, Violet's changed social status following her remarriage is also evident in advertisements she placed in newspapers seeking domestics. Violet continued to write to the Women's Pages in the 1940s, providing comfort and encouragement to women dealing with child illness or grieving the death of an infant or child. She kept writing about her 9 children. She mentioned her youngest son beginning high school, another starting employment as a postal clerk, and how many children were home for Christmas. She was particularly proud of having 4 sons in the services, including 2 in the Air Force, and narrated 2 Ralph's sons' double wedding and her daughter getting married. In 1949, Violet and her husband had moved into town, living at Hay, while their son, William George, ran the station. And Violet lived to 80 years, dying in 1972. The second character I want to introduce you to is the evocatively named Melly Dust. She initially wrote to the Women's Pages requesting material support of baby clothes just before the birth of her 4th child. And she became another much-loved contributor. And she said in her first letter, "The letters in your paper are a great help to the countrywoman. I live in the Northern Mallee. We came here 5 years ago with money and health, and today we have neither, and I am feeling downhearted. We were burnt out a few months ago, and now my husband has been in hospital. I have 3 children, all little mites, and another one coming early in March. I noticed, Miranda, some of your writers were offering baby clothes. I would be glad of some, as I am in a real fix and no money to buy any. We live on eggs and potatoes. My children have not tasted fruit for 2 months." Several readers responded, packing up parcels of baby clothes and sending them to her. And 2 months later, Melly Dust wrote from hospital, thanking readers for their letters and help and sharing the news of the arrival of her baby, a wee baby girl. "I'm a very happy mother, and I feel that this little babe has brought a ray of sunshine into my life after the troublesome year that I've had." And a number of readers sent messages to her via the Women's Pages. "I rejoice with you, Melly Dust, that everything is all right and you're happy with your wee babe," wrote Mammy. "I hope all the rest of our sisters who are expecting the stalk have lovely babies to comfort them. I have had 13. So the Women's Pages were a space where the birth of healthy babies was celebrated. also reflecting societal emphasis on the importance of healthy white babies in an era of populate or perish. Now, writing to request material assistance with baby child clothes or shoes was frequent, but emotional support was also a key reason for writing. And many women wrote letters of how they were dreading the birth of a 6th or 7th or 8th child and not knowing how they would cope. Another farmer's wife wrote in response to Jeanette's letter on falling pregnant with an unplanned for and unwanted child, but she was in a similar situation, had 6 children and was expecting her 7th. And she said, I would like to send a letter of encouragement to Jeanette. I'm much in the same boat. And she said, I might say I was very depressed for the first few months, but I began to think that it was not going to do myself or the little one any good. So now I look on the bright side of things and pray God to give me health and strength to rear my little one when it arrives. So cheer up, Jeanette, and trust in God. I'm sure everything will come right for you. And in years to come, if we are spared, we shall have our family to work and help us. And then we shall be able to have our holidays without worrying about who is going to look after the farm while we're away. Nice fantasy. Mally Dust became a long-standing contributor to the Women's Bureau, attracting significant reader interest and sympathy for her troubles. After her 4th child's birth, her husband became very ill. She wrote explaining that she was not able to answer all the beautiful letters she received and to thank readers for parcels, saying she would answer them as soon as things brighten again. In 1934, 2 years after her child's birth, Mally Dust wrote explaining that her husband had passed away. It's a very long time since I wrote, but I've had 2 years of misery watching over one I loved suffering. And her letter focused on her desire to wrest from life the best that I can get for my children. Her eldest was 9 and her youngest 2, and she recounted. When I broke down at the table, the eldest girl said, "Never mind, Mother, I will help you to be Mummy." And my only son of 6 years said in quite a big voice, "And I'll help you to be Daddy." Mally Dust wrote that she'd been offered homes for 2 of her children, but insisted, "I come from the wrong stock to part with any of them. I'll keep them all together." She thanked several Mallee women by name for their help and kindness and told readers she was living down south now. She'd moved to Stawell. A year later, Mally Dust wrote again, apologising for not writing, explaining that she was busy caring for her children and working, and documented how she coped as a working widow with 4 young children. Whoops. My children are young. The eldest is just 10 years, but I depend on her a lot. I have to leave her with the little ones very often. I do a fair amount of night work at times and have to put them to bed and leave them alone, and perhaps to not get back until 1 o'clock in the morning. I've gone around and kissed them goodnight and left them with a lump in my throat many a time and just prayed that God would take care of them. Mally Dust emphasised her struggle and exhaustion. A mother does some battling. Many a tear I shed when I get overtired, but you have to buck up again. She told readers, "I don't mind how hard I work, as long as they grow up good men and women and I can fit them for what lies ahead. Somehow I think they'll be all right, for they're thoughtful youngsters. Let's hope they will." Mally Dust had a gift for upbeat colloquial expression, and her letters provided encouragement to other readers in the style of stoical exhortation. And she said, "I always think where there's a will, there's a way, no matter how bad things are. So cheer up, folks who are having hard times. You have plenty of mates in the same boat." While Mally just juggled work by leaving her young children with her 10-year-old, other letters showed the relinquishment of children was common by women whose husbands were unemployed, or women who'd been widowed or deserted and needed to work. Live-in domestic service, the most common work available for rural women, was usually incompatible with children, and working with a preschool-aged child was often not possible. Inasmuch wrote on behalf of a friend who was a widow with 2 daughters, who wasn't able to keep both her children while going out to service, and asked if anyone would give the younger daughter a home. She's finding that she cannot manage to properly look after them both as she would wish, and would like to find a nice home for the younger one. The little girl is bright and intelligent and healthy. As domestic service was one of the few options open to rural women, married women who'd been deserted or widowed had few options for employment. And to gain employment often required relinquishing a child or children. I have a fine little lad, just over 2. I would like some kind of person to adopt, as I have to work for my living, and few care for an extra one when hiring, wrote Rose 2 from South Gippsland. And Dark Clouds wrote, I'm married with 2 kiddies, 3 and 6 years, and have had much ill luck. My husband has been unemployed for a long time. Does anyone require a capable woman? Help. I can milk, bake bread, good cook. Will take cook, general position and housekeepers and go anywhere. I would like to take my youngest child with me. Now, the Women's Bureau also started a social club which women could join and receive a badge. It held a face-to-face gathering at the Herald Rooms in Melbourne, near Southern Cross, Spencer Street, and a picnic. And in spring 1934, Mally Duss wrote excitedly, I am looking forward to the basket picnic and our evening at the Herald Rooms. I'm getting a bit of a flutter at the thought of it. She finished off her letter. Before I come to Melbourne, I must shake the Mally dust off me and get rid of all the hay bands and see there is no binder twine about me. Her writing style and stories engaged readers who repeatedly wrote asking how Mally Dust was and saying they missed her letters. And although Mally Dust said she wanted to keep her pen name secret, people in Stawell evidently knew she was Mally Dust. And in 1939, a photograph of her with her 4 children was included in the women's pages. Unfortunately, I haven't got time to discuss other letter writers that raised issues of infertility, teenage pregnancy, forced adoption, raising children and discipline. But to conclude, Heather and Mally Dust's letters emphasised that white rural motherhood was a central theme in the Weekly Times women's pages, and that reading and writing about their experiences as mothers created an emotional community. In the opening column, Miranda had invited readers to share stories of baby woes, and rural readers embraced this opportunity. They celebrated births, empathised with child and mother illness, and grieved at infant and child deaths, while also sharing parenting tips and advice. Rural and remote location and geographical isolation was central to women's experience of mothering. But whiteness, class, the economic context of the Depression and marital status was also crucial to women's experiences of motherhood. Being well off enough to have a domestic servant changed experiences of motherhood, as did having 7 children with a husband out of work or being a deserted wife or widow. The Weekly Times Women's Bureau gave isolated white women on farms a thread that connected them to a community of other mothers. It was a space to share their experiences of mothering and receive emotional and practical support. The column made women's experiences visible to each other, but also provided enough anonymity through pen names to allow some painful topics to be aired. These experiences were shaped and mediated by Miranda and by acceptable forms of expression about mothering. Letters were shaped by cultural and racial ideas and anxieties. There was a strong emphasis on motherly feelings, healthy babies, joyful motherhood and attachment. And motherhood was an inevitable topic in the women's pages, being an approved expression of white womanhood. While birth was celebrated, women wrote nothing about their physical experiences of labour or childbirth. These bodily experiences were not considered appropriate for sharing in the public realm of the women's pages. Birth control and family limitation, highly relevant to rural women with 6, 7 and 8 children. But this discussion was actively censored by Miranda. Mothering at this time was subject to intense cultural and social anxiety. Government rhetoric was strongly encouraging white women to populate or perish, and experts were focusing on making motherhood more scientific and effective. The ideals of the division of labour, in which women should focus primarily on the domestic sphere, remained prominent, even in rural life. However, the realities of rural life in the 1930s put these ideals under pressure. While the forum was an outlet for rural women to have a voice and to be part of a community, it was also highly contained and performative within social expectations of the time. Thank you.
Wow, that's tough times, tough ladies. Eh? Let's open to questions first from the audience here in the room. We've got a microphone, so just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. Please, if you don't mind saying who you are.
I don't need the microphone, is that okay?
No, you do.
Just so
People
the
are
Zoom
watching
people
live.
Oh, sorry about those people. Yeah, hi there. I don't know if it's just what you've focused on, or if it's the truth that a very wide spectrum of social class was not represented in those particular forums. For example, the people who own properties 10 times the size of hers next door, what was the experience of those women, etc. You know, is there any evidence that you uncovered of their experiences? Would they participate in something like that, or would they have lots of other forums and extended family networks and so on, and money to bolster their woes, for example?
Yeah, really great question.
Thank you.
What's really interesting about the letters is that it does encompass a really diverse spectrum of writers. So it encompasses people that are trying to get work. It encompasses women on relatively well-off farms, and they often write lots of really poetic letters about how beautiful the countryside is, and also the trials of you know, having to manage the servants. So they wrote about different things, but certainly wealthy women did contribute to the women's pages, but wrote different kinds of letters.
Any other questions in the room? See some questions for me.
My name is Sunny. I noticed in your talk you referred to the white woman's experience all the way through. Is there as much documentation about the experience of Indigenous women during those times?
Yeah, really good question. Indigenous women and Indigenous experience are pretty much erased in the pages. There's sometimes a mention of, you know, the last black in the area, or some reminiscences about Aboriginal tribes. But the women that are writing, many of them see themselves as, you know, hardy pioneers. And it's in tiny little things, like, for example, when I was searching for stuff about the property at Orabin, one of the mentions was that Bill Nisbet had an ad for a lost dog, which was called Nigger. So, you know, those derogatory kind of attitudes that percolated are part of, you know, pastoral pioneering white women's experiences. But there's a lot of silence. And of course, we know what was happening for Aboriginal communities at this time in terms of, you know, the breakup of missions and reserve, the removal of children from families. So while the state is, you know, supporting white women to have babies, the exact opposite is happening for Indigenous women. There's no mention of even though these women are living in rural areas where there's significant Indigenous communities, and there's articles about child removal in the mainstream press, I haven't found mention of those in the women's pages, even though I know, you know, there's so much in the press about Indigenous child removal. So yeah, it's another thing to keep thinking about, the ways that women of this generation constructed their identity and the kind of the erasure around Indigenous experience.
And probably Indigenous pastoral workers on those properties. Well, We've got another question here.
Actually, I'm Emma, the Bendigo historian. No, I'm from Bendigo originally, so I'm a bit new to Australian women's experience in this period. And I was really fascinated by just towards the end when you were talking about the Women's Bureau and the picnics and things like this, and really made me think about, I mean, in the contemporary, the way in which some sort of virtual friendships become real. And I just wondered, how did those spaces work? Especially given that people had used pen names and had that degree of anonymity, and as you talked about that social diversity, do we know much about what happened at these events?
Yeah, really great question, Emma. I think except maybe for Melly Dust, a lot of the women who were in the social club or were organisers were definitely more affluent, and some of them were actually urban. But it seemed to be, it was probably once a year. It was always during Melbourne Showtime, when rural women might be down with the CWA or having events, in the show, or down with their husbands who were exhibiting, sheep or cattle. But certainly they were really excited to meet people, as well as, of course, to meet Miranda, the editor, who would come along with her adopted child, the little lass, whose photos featured prominently in the pages all the time, but that's another paper. But absolutely this desire to have connections, and it's both face-to-face, but it's also pen names. Pen friends. So many of these women wrote to Miranda to get names of people, and they would then write off press, and they would then form these friendships with these women, and they would visit them. And they'd say, I'm going to be passing through, stall, can I visit you? So, they sussed out people's identities. And the badge was also a way of making visible that they were a writer.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Talk brief, thank you. I'm Desiree, I'm from the Archive Centre. You touched on some of the reasons that you think that women sort of brought themselves to be part of this letter writing process and community. Did you get any feeling as you were going through your research as to whether there's any parallels contemporarily? Is there something that's happening these days that you think these women would be, is there any parallels these days of what was going on back then? Is it happening today, but just in a different format?
Yeah, really interesting question, Desiree. I mean, I think there are parallels with social media in that it's a space where women can voice their experiences and get feedback. Whether it's on, what do I do with, little Alison, she's not eating, and people will post suggestions of how to handle that. So there's that. There's the craving for connection with other women that are going through similar things. And I guess when I was thinking about rereading Melly Dust's excitement about going to the face-to-face gathering, I mean, it was just like us getting out of lockdown. It was like, wow, real life people in the flesh. So absolutely, I think there are those parallels, but of course there are differences. I mean, this is not immediate posting. Some of these women were in areas where they wouldn't get the paper for maybe 4 days. Then they would write a letter, then the post would take this many days to get to Miranda, and then it might get published. And then they wouldn't read the paper, until 5 days after it had been published. So it might be a month, so that the exchange is much slower. And there is something about, I think, the physical act of writing a letter that means, these women craft their letters. It's not a quick post that's gone into cyberspace. Many of these are crafted letters, and they sit and they think, and they might cross something out and rewrite it. I had this fantasy that I was going to go to the Weekly Times and find the stash of the original letters and the little book where Miranda kept everyone's pen names, and would be able to see the extent of the attitude. But of course, I didn't find it in the Weekly Times archives. That's
It would have been awesome.
Yeah.
And there's a question.
Hi, Lydia. I was curious about the creation of the safe space. That's more or less virtual, I suppose. It's the designing your own identity as sort of a safety measure. I was wondering if there were any barriers stopping or prohibiting non-middle class white women from being able to submit under an alias and create those relationships that they would otherwise not be able to have, or access resources from other mothers without giving away that they're an immigrant or perhaps they were Indigenous if they had access. I was just wondering, yeah, what sort of barriers would prohibit those spaces from being reached by these women?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think the class one, I'll do the class one first, because I guess what's the context to this is compulsory state education. So these women, many of them have been at school as required under the law until 14, even if girls left school at 12 or whatever. But many of them, you know, have this amazing, you know, they're literate, they've read poetry, they've read short stories and novels, and you can see that in their writing, you know, the way that they use words. So I think that's a really important context. And certainly we know with the letters that women wrote, you know, asking for, you know, just old clothing to cut up and make clothing. It's certainly working class women or women on poor farms are participating. And they're doing that because they have a financial benefit in participating, you know. So Melly Dust got the baby clothes. She got sent some fresh fruit from a farmer for her kids. So there's that aspect. I mean, you know, you might want to call it welfare or charity, but it's different, I think, because it's women who are asking for it rather than, you know, welfare agencies. The issue about ethnicity is a really interesting one. There are some letters from migrants, but most of the people who claim themselves are migrants are English migrants or Welsh or Scottish. That obviously changes, you know, in the 50s, but certainly in the 30s, in the period where I've really looked at this intensely, you know, there's a couple of letters from European migrant women, but they're predominantly, you know, from the UK. And of course that reflects the migration processes to Australia and the White Australia policy. I'm just trying to think, you know, some people claimed that ethnic identity in their pen name. So, you know, a Yorkshire lass. So that kind of, many of those British migrants really, their regional identity was absolute, you know, was part of their pen name, which says something about, which I think is really interesting as well.
We're going to move to the online questions, sorry, to the people in the room. I know there's time for you to chat with Ruth afterwards, so we'll go to the online question.
Hi, I'm not online. I'm pretending to be Kat Allinghouse, who's also a La Trobe history person. And she says, thanks for such a wonderful, evocative paper, Ruth. I was struck by the community of female support that you've discovered and wondered if the community ever excluded or policed their members. Were there ever any negative or unsupportive responses?
Yeah, great question, Kat. I have to say, I've looked at another paper, which was the paper of the Victorian Farmers Union, which also had women's letters pages. And that was pretty, in that, you know, women did slam each other and there was less kind of editorial intervention. So women would write saying, a woman who milks more than whatever cat, you know, 10 cows a day isn't feminine. And other women would write, you know, saying, you know, our family needs us. So certainly women did, you know, slag off depending on their views, whether they were wealthier and had certain views about outside work not being, a certain level of outside work not being acceptable. And other women who worked as farmhands or housekeepers also kind of wrote challenging the upper class, you know, ideals of rural femininity as well.
Do we have any other questions on Zoom? You want to put that quickly into the chat, or we'll move back to the questions in the room? Right, there's a question up here.
My name's Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. That was really interesting. I was just struck by the person who asked about modern equivalence. In the Women's Weekly a couple of months ago, there was a story about two women who they'd had twins. One had twin girls, the other had twin boys. And the twin boys have ADHD, I think. And they were both feeling in need of support. And somehow they found each other, perhaps through a face-to-face group, but they've started a podcast, which is just, and they've received the most incredible amount of support, not just in Australia, but apparently from all over the world. And there's quite an extensive article about it. And it's quite interesting when you think about these women and what they were doing. And the fact that women today can experience that same isolation unless they manage to find a community, because you know, women with small children, especially twins, are often very isolated even today. So it was interesting that they found a modern way to, I suppose, to express that.
Yeah, really interesting parallel, Val. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I think the other thing that strikes me is that these women, you know, they're having to write a response, find the money for a postage stamp, go to the post office. So they're absolutely, you know, their desire to be in connection and to have a voice is really strong. And I think that just comes through that this, you know, community is, you know, is a support to them because of their geographical isolation.
Any other questions before we think about finishing up? Well, if that's the case, please join me in thanking Ruth for a wonderful project. I'm thinking how horrifying it is to know that these people then go through a terrible drought. So they're already having hard times, and then there's a devastating drought and a war. So it's a really tough times for the community that need each other. Now, it's my sorry task to tell you that today is the final Discovering History seminar for 2021. So we're really grateful for the contributors this year, and particularly to Ruth for convening. And we have some small tokens of appreciation.
And a little bit I want to say. So I'm Vivian from Bendigo Library, and I was here at the beginning when Ruth came to us and floated the idea of some Discovering History sessions in this style. As we said in the beginning, it was the 2nd of November 2017 that we started. There's been a wide range of topics presented by passionate and knowledgeable speakers to a very diverse and committed audience. It's also been one of the library's most successful partnerships in all the years of doing programs with organisations in town. So it's been a really special thing for us as well. We can use words like through thick and thin, here and there, in person and online, live and recorded, Zoom and YouTube. Who knew we would know how to do Zoom and YouTube? And of course, the big one, in these unprecedented times, to describe the how and where of the sessions that have been held. More than 1,300 people have attended, or 50 to 100 people have attended up to 23 times. So I can count 23 sessions that went ahead over the 4 years. Everything moved out for a little while until we got our sound system and our seating a bit more efficient and came back again. And then, of course, we've all been in and out of shutdowns over the time. We've been allured by the glitter of gold many times, investigated the lack of water and the enterprising ways of overcoming it, talked about faith, religion, and the Jewish community, housed and fed our community with tomatoes, beer, and chocolate, and learned a lot about the role of for and of women and children over the ages. And we can't forget the Jezebels of Bernal Street. Ruth has wrangled all of these into place and taken her turn at the podium. It's fitting that she's tonight's speaker and that we're talking about women again in the world of history where they're often hidden. And one of the best things about the last 4 years of discovering history is that women have been front and centre so often that we're bringing out into the open the history that's not always in the books. The fact that we had to go online means that these are recorded, and so there's about 7 or 8 of the past 2 years sessions that are still available to watch on our YouTube channel, and that's taken us to a whole other audience, to the people that have been able to come in. And Ruth, you've been the key person in all of this, and we just want to say thank you for making this great series happen. So we're also looking for ideas for next year's series. So if you have a passionate history subject, a new book ready to launch, a revelatory piece of research, or know someone else who has, we need to know. So let's get next year off to another one. We've all had a hell of a couple of years. So it's been exciting, it's been great, it's been so entertaining with the topics that we've all been able to learn about. And it's thank you to you.
And Trobe, it's been a fantastic collaboration to work with the Bendigo Regional Archives Centre and the Goldfields Library. You know, to hear from wide-ranging historians in the community, academics, local historians, heritage professionals, archivists, has been really fantastic. And for you, the regular participants, thank you for all that you've brought to the seminars by being, you know, regular attendees, and of course all the local knowledge that the speakers have just loved getting from the questions that have been asked, which I think has made this such a rich collaboration, which is, you know, the collaboration between the university and the community. So next year, we're not quite sure what will happen, but thank you, and thank you very much. And especially the library's tech team, which has just been amazing, especially through COVID. So Jordan's just been doing an awesome job. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.